The snow had already started to fall by the time Jake and his friends, Marcus and Ellie, left the main highway. They had been driving for hours, cutting through winding forest roads that were barely wide enough for a single vehicle. Jake was behind the wheel of his beat-up Jeep Cherokee, the engine straining as it climbed over frozen ruts in the road. The trees loomed close on either side, tall pines and oaks shrouded in mist, their branches weighed down by the first heavy snow of the season. The sun had set hours ago, leaving a dull gray twilight that made the forest feel oppressive and alive. They were on their way to a remote cabin in northern Vermont, a place Marcus's uncle had rented for the winter. The cabin wasn't on any GPS, and cell reception had dropped hours ago. Ellie had been joking at first, trying to lighten the tension that grew with every mile deeper into the forest. But her laughter was hollow, and soon even she stopped talking. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the scrape of tires against icy gravel and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. The cabin appeared suddenly, almost as if it had been hidden by the forest itself. It was small, made of weathered logs, with dark windows and a single flickering light by the front door. A thin plume of smoke rose from the chimney, but the smell of wood smoke was faint, almost non-existent. They parked, and Jake noticed that the tracks leading to the cabin looked old, as if no one had come here in weeks. Inside, the cabin was cramped but warm, lit by a few oil lamps and the fireplace. Dust coated the surfaces, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. The three of them set down their bags, trying to shake off the chill from the drive. Marcus checked the generators and the stove while Ellie and Jake explored the rooms. Everything seemed functional but untouched, like the cabin was waiting for visitors who would never leave. By nightfall, the wind had picked up outside, howling through the trees and rattling the windows. Jake sat near the fireplace, trying to get a signal on his phone. No luck. Marcus was in the kitchen, making instant soup, while Ellie had settled into a corner with a book. That's when they first heard it. A faint knocking, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from outside. They froze. The cabin was deep in the woods. There was no one else for miles. Probably just a branch, Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. The knocking continued, soft at first, then louder, closer. Jake grabbed a flashlight and went to the door. When he opened it, nothing was there, just the snow-covered path, the trees swaying in the wind. But then he noticed footprints, bare footprints, leading to the cabin and stopping right at the threshold. They were fresh, though no one could have walked through the snow unseen. There were no prints leading away. The three of them spent the rest of the night awake, listening to the wind and the occasional knock, which never seemed to come from the same direction twice. They tried to sleep in shifts, but the sounds were relentless, like the forest itself was breathing around them. The next morning, they found more evidence that something had been there. Inside the cabin, small things were moved, chairs slightly shifted, a knife on the counter turned upside down. Nothing was missing, but everything felt wrong. They packed their things and considered leaving, but when they tried to start the Jeep, the battery was dead. There was no way to call for help, no other roads visible through the thickening snow. By the second night, the knocking had turned into scratching, coming from the walls and the roof. They could hear breathing, shallow and irregular, echoing through the rooms. Jake armed himself with a fire poker, and Marcus found a small hatchet in the kitchen drawer. Ellie tried to convince them it was an animal, but even she wasn't sure anymore. The sounds were too methodical, too intelligent. Around midnight, a shadow passed by the window. At first, they thought it was a trick of the firelight. But then it appeared again, tall, humanoid, moving in jerky, unnatural motions. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, staring at them with dark, glimmering eyes. They screamed, banging on the walls and shouting, but the figure didn't move. Then it vanished. The nights that followed were worse. The figure came closer, always staying just beyond the tree line. They could hear whispers in the wind, indistinct voices speaking in a language that was almost English, but twisted, broken. It mimicked them sometimes, calling their names. The cabin seemed to shift around them, the doors leading to different rooms than before, the windows showing the forest in impossible ways. One morning, Marcus opened a closet and found himself staring into the middle of the forest, though the walls hadn't moved. It was like the cabin itself had become part of the woods. Their food ran out, and they were trapped by the snowstorm that had become relentless. By the third night, panic had taken hold. They barricaded themselves in the main room, but the scratching on the walls escalated, now accompanied by thuds from the roof and a low growl that vibrated through the floor. Jake tried to call for help again. The phone was dead. Even their walkie-talkies picked up only static. Then the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse, pressing down on them like a living weight. They heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Something was inside now. They could see its shadow on the walls, long and thin, sometimes splitting into multiple forms, sometimes just a single figure towering over them. It wasn't until the fourth night that they realized the cabin itself was the trap. The walls pulsed subtly, almost like breathing. The rooms shifted if you didn't look directly at them. Corridors would extend endlessly or collapse in on themselves. The creature, if it could be called that, seemed to be testing them, observing how fear changed their behavior. And it spoke, not in words but in thought, projecting images of their worst memories, their deepest regrets, twisting them into visions that left them shaking and hollow-eyed. Marcus disappeared first. One moment he was barricading the door with Jake, and the next, he was gone. Jake and Ellie searched the cabin, calling his name, finding nothing but the echo of his last screams, which seemed to stretch infinitely through the walls. Ellie was the next to vanish, dragged silently into a room that hadn't been there moments before. Jake realized with a sinking dread that the cabin didn't just contain them, it was consuming them, erasing them from reality. He tried to leave, but the forest outside had transformed. The snow-covered path he had driven down was gone. In its place, an endless tangle of blackened trees and deep shadows stretched in every direction. He ran blindly, screaming, the whispers of the creature surrounding him, mocking him, showing him impossible vistas of his own death. By the seventh night, Jake was alone, wandering through corridors that defied geometry. Windows showed impossible landscapes, forests under alien skies, lakes that reflected not stars but screams. His flashlight flickered, and the oil lamps sputtered out. Every sound was amplified, the whisper of a branch, the drip of melting snow, the growl of something moving just beyond his sight. He could no longer tell where he was, or if he was still inside the cabin, or somewhere far worse. The last thing Jake remembered was standing in what looked like the main room, only larger, infinite, with no ceiling, the walls stretching up into darkness. The figure appeared again, taller now, impossibly thin, and its eyes glimmered with something that was not human. It whispered directly into his mind, a single thought that repeated endlessly. "You're mine now." Somewhere, far away, the jeep remained, the tracks leading to the cabin buried under a thick layer of snow. The cabin itself was gone when search parties eventually scoured the area months later, replaced only by an empty clearing and trees scarred by the storm. No bodies were ever found, no footprints, no sign that anyone had ever been there, except for the faint whispers carried on the wind, calling out names that no one remembered anymore. Locals avoided the area, telling stories of the lost cabin in the woods, and travelers who dared wander into the forest sometimes spoke of hearing knocks and scratching at night, though when they returned, there was never anything there. Years later, some say the cabin still exists, hidden in the endless maze of the forest, waiting for the next unlucky souls. The snow falls differently there, heavier, slower, and the trees seem darker, taller, almost sentient. And if you listen closely, you can hear the faintest whisper of three names: Jake, Marcus, Ellie. Story the end. The first thing you notice when you're deep in the northern wilderness of Maine isn't the quiet. It's the way the quiet presses against you, like it's alive, like it's waiting. I'd grown up in Portland, had seen enough city lights to know what normal darkness looked like, but out here past Baxter State Park, past the logging roads that twist like snake trails through the forest, darkness isn't just the absence of light. It's a weight, a presence. I was out there with two friends from college, Sean and Mark. We decided to do a week-long hike into a section of the forest that's practically untouched by humans. Maps exist, but the trails are rough, the roads to the trailheads barely maintained. It was supposed to be fun, a break from grad school stress, a taste of something primal and real. Our packs were heavy with food, tents, and the essentials. Phones, of course, were useless once we got beyond the cell towers. The first 2 days were exactly what we expected. Crisp air, the smell of pine needles, the occasional deer darting between trees. But on the third night, as we set up camp near a small stream, something about the forest shifted. It was subtle at first, a pause in the bird song, a stillness in the wind. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just the forest settling down for the night. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of something moving outside my tent. Not the normal rustle of branches or the scurry of small animals. This was heavier, deliberate. I froze, straining to listen. There was a rhythm to it, slow steps around our camp, circling us. I nudged Sean, whispered to him, and he stirred, groggy. "Probably a bear," he muttered. "Don't move." But neither of us could sleep. By morning we laughed it off, convinced our minds were playing tricks. But then we found the prints. They weren't bear prints. They were too large, too elongated, almost human in shape, but with an odd splay to the toes and a pronounced arch that made them look almost wrong. They circled the perimeter of our camp in a perfect loop, like whoever, or whatever, was watching us, had stayed outside all night. We tried to shake it off and pressed on. But as we hiked deeper into the forest, the feeling didn't leave. I noticed it most, how the shadows seemed to cling to the trees, how the wind carried strange, almost whispering noises. Mark joked nervously about ghosts or old logging spirits, but the joke didn't land. By the 5th day, we were well past the mapped trails, relying on compass bearings and instinct. That's when the first sign that we weren't alone happened again. We came across an abandoned cabin hidden in a grove of pines. It was small, ramshackle, and smelled faintly of rot. Windows were boarded, the door hung crookedly. Something about it was wrong. Sean suggested we keep moving, but Mark wanted to investigate. Inside, it was empty, mostly, except for the walls. Someone had scratched words into the wooden planks, frantic, jagged letters. I couldn't make out most of them in the dim light, but one phrase repeated, "Don't follow the sound." We left immediately, shaken. The forest seemed to close in behind us, the canopy so thick it was like walking through a tunnel of green and shadow. That night, we camped near a rocky ridge. I thought I heard voices calling my name, low, urgent whispers from the trees. I woke the others. We spent hours listening, but there was no one there. Only the echoing forest, mocking us. By the 6th day, we were lost. Compass bearings spun, landmarks we'd counted on were gone. The streams didn't match the map. Even the sun seemed disoriented, streaking the sky in angles that didn't make sense. That's when I saw the first figure. It was standing between two birches, far enough away to be unsure if it was real. Tall, thin, impossibly still, pale skin that seemed to absorb the light, and eyes that reflected nothing. I blinked, and it was gone. But the memory of it clung to my mind, a shadow in my thoughts. Sean saw it too. Mark tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. We started moving faster, trying to retrace our steps. That's when the sounds started. Low, dragging footsteps that weren't ours, following us. Always following. At first, it stayed distant, but every time we stopped, it stopped. Every time we moved, it moved. There was no rational explanation, no animal, no human, just the knowledge that we were being hunted. The 7th day, desperation set in. Hunger gnawed at us. Our water supply was low, and the streams we found tasted off, metallic like iron. We stumbled into a clearing in the late afternoon, and there it was. Another cabin, this one newer, almost clean. A faint trail of smoke rose from a chimney. Relief flooded through us, foolishly. Someone was here. Maybe help, maybe safety. But the door was open. Inside, the smell hit us first, sickly sweet rot. The walls were lined with crude drawings, similar to the scratches from before, depicting human figures being dragged into the woods, screaming faces etched in panic. In the center, a small fire pit. Around it, symbols carved into the floor. Something was very wrong. And then we heard it. The dragging footsteps again, outside. Close now. Too close. We ran, leaving packs, leaving everything. The forest seemed alive, branches clawing at us, shadows bending to block our path. Panic drove us. I don't remember how far we ran, only that when we stopped, we were in a small valley, moonlight reflecting off a stagnant pond. And we weren't alone. Figures emerged from the tree line. Tall, pale, unblinking. Silent, but their presence filled the air. We froze. My mind screamed to move, to run, but it felt like the forest itself was holding us, rooting us in place. And then they vanished, just as suddenly as they appeared, leaving only silence. We made a decision then. We had to get to a road. Any road. We moved west, guided by instinct and fading daylight. The forest tried to mislead us, paths twisting, rivers looping back. Night fell, cold and absolute. Sean and Mark were whispering now, trying to convince each other, trying to convince themselves we'd make it. I kept seeing movement in the shadows, shapes that weren't human. On the 8th day, delirium set in. Hunger, thirst, fear. We stumbled onto what looked like a logging road. It was overgrown, abandoned, but it was linear, a chance at escape. And then we saw tracks, not our own, drag marks, and something that had to be human, but wasn't quite. Our hearts sank. Whatever had been following us had walked this same road, perhaps for years, waiting. We ran until dawn, collapsing near a small creek, too weak to continue. That's when we saw a car, an old rusted station wagon, half buried in undergrowth. We ran to it, shaking it, trying to open it, keys inside, doors unlocked, and inside, more of those drawings carved into the seats, etched into the dashboard. Faces screaming, hands reaching out from the wood. We didn't care. We left, ran blindly until we found a main road. A passing truck driver gave us a ride to a town. Police found nothing when we led them back. No footprints, no cabins, nothing in the woods, just a vast empty wilderness, as if it had never happened. I still think about it. The forest doesn't end. It doesn't forgive. And sometimes when the wind carries through my apartment at night, I swear I hear dragging footsteps, following me, waiting for the next time I wander too far. Story. The end. The first time I heard about Echo Lake, it was from my friend Mike, who swore it was the most isolated place in northern Maine. He said it wasn't on any major maps, just a few coordinates scribbled in old forestry guides. It's beautiful, he told me one night over beers, but no one goes there for long. People just disappear. I laughed it off, but something about the way he said it stayed with me. I wasn't supposed to be alone that summer. My plan was a solo hiking trip across Maine's backcountry, nothing fancy. I'd done long treks before, but I wanted to push myself farther into isolation than usual. I rented an old cabin near Baxter State Park, stockpiled supplies, and made sure someone knew my route. That's when Mike texted me the coordinates for Echo Lake. It was about a day's hike from the main trails. Just go, he said. You'll see why it's different. The first day of the hike was normal. Pine needles underfoot, the scent of wet earth, birds that only seemed to call once before silence reclaimed the forest. I followed a rough logging trail for hours, crossing a narrow creek on slick stones, my pack weighing me down. By late afternoon, the sun was low, and the forest grew colder than the weather should have allowed. I could feel the shadows stretching longer, swallowing the trail behind me. I made camp near a cluster of firs and built a fire, trying to ignore the strange sensation that I wasn't alone. There was a sound, a snapping branch, like something large moving through the underbrush. I called out. Nothing. Just the whisper of wind in the treetops. I told myself it was a deer or a raccoon. But when I checked my GPS, the coordinates had shifted slightly. I must have veered off the trail. By the next morning, I realized I hadn't seen any other hiker. No planes overhead, no logging trucks in the distance. Just the forest stretching endlessly. I pushed on, and by late afternoon, I caught my first glimpse of the lake. It wasn't much, just a small, mirror-like body of water surrounded by pines, but something about it felt wrong. There was no bird song, no breeze disturbing its surface. Just stillness. I set up my tent near the shore, unpacked my gear, and tried to enjoy the quiet. That's when I noticed the cabin. It was old, probably abandoned, set a few hundred feet back in the trees. Smoke curled from its chimney. I froze. There shouldn't be anyone there. Not for miles. The lake was supposed to be empty. Curiosity overpowered caution. I walked toward it, each step quiet on the mossy ground. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and the smell hit me first. Damp wood, rotting leaves, and something else. Something metallic, like blood. The interior was barren, except for a few broken chairs and a fireplace filled with ashes that were still warm. I stepped inside, heart hammering, and that's when I heard it. A low hum, like someone muttering under their breath. I spun around. No one. The hum grew louder, then stopped. Silence. I grabbed my pack and bolted back to my tent, convincing myself it was a trick of the wind. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every rustle in the trees, every splash in the lake felt amplified. I kept thinking I saw movement in the shadows, but when I turned on my flashlight, there was nothing. The next day, I decided to explore the far side of the lake. I noticed strange markers carved into the trees, symbols I didn't recognize. Some were scratched deep into the bark, others just faint outlines. They looked almost like letters, but twisted. The farther I walked, the heavier the forest felt, like it was pressing in on me. By the time I reached a small clearing, I stumbled upon a circle of stones with bones. Small animal bones, but not all of them. Some looked like human fragments, eroded and yellowed with age. I froze, stomach churning. I thought about Mike's text, his warning that people disappear. My rational mind tried to deny it, but the unease was undeniable. I started back toward my camp, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, human but too large, too deep, as if someone or something had been moving through the mud at incredible speed. And they didn't lead to my path. They circled the lake, vanishing into the trees. That night I didn't sleep at all. Around midnight, I woke to a whispering sound, voices coming from the lake itself. I scrambled out of my tent. The water was still, black as tar, but faint figures moved beneath its surface. Faces, twisting and reaching. I blinked. Nothing. My mind was playing tricks. I had to be imagining it. But the footprints from yesterday had returned, leading right up to my tent. By morning, I decided I had to leave. I packed my gear quickly and tried to retrace my steps. The forest, which had seemed straightforward the day before, was now a maze. Trails looped back on themselves, trees looked identical, the sun hidden behind thick canopy. Hours passed, and I realized I had no idea which way was out. Every path led to the same eerie clearing by the lake. I tried calling for help. My satellite phone had no signal. My GPS blinked in confusion, coordinates jumping randomly. Panic set in. I shouted, but my voice returned muffled, as if the forest itself was swallowing it. By evening, I had no choice but to camp again. Exhausted, I fell asleep, only to wake to the sound of footsteps circling my tent. Heavy, deliberate, always keeping just out of sight. The next morning, the footprints were gone. The lake was empty, calm again, no hint of the whispers or faces. I dared to think I had imagined it. I began walking, determined to find the main trail. Hours passed. I didn't eat. I didn't stop. The sun dropped low and the forest seemed to grow darker, denser. Shadows twisted unnaturally. I saw movement in the corner of my vision, figures standing just beyond the tree line. But when I turned, they vanished. By nightfall, I found myself on a ridge overlooking the lake. The water shimmered unnaturally under the moonlight, and that's when I saw it. A man standing at the edge of the lake, perfectly still. I called out. No response. He didn't move. As I watched, more figures appeared, emerging from the tree line, silently converging on the shore. I wanted to run, but my legs refused. Fear rooted me in place. Suddenly, one figure turned toward me. Its face was pale, eyes hollow, mouth open in a silent scream. I stumbled backward, tripping over roots, falling down the ridge. I hit the ground hard, my head spinning. When I looked up, the figures were gone, vanished into the darkness. I spent the rest of the night huddled behind a boulder, shivering, listening to the lake. At first light, I began moving again, driven by sheer terror. I walked for hours, following what I hoped was the main trail. Exhaustion made my vision blur. My stomach burned with hunger. My lips cracked, and then I saw it. A logging road, fresh and straight, cutting through the forest. Salvation. I ran until I collapsed at the edge of the road, waving my arms at a truck that passed. The driver stopped, called the authorities. I gave them my coordinates. They brought search teams to Echo Lake the next day. All they found was the cabin, empty and cold, and a circle of stones I had seen before. But no footprints, no bones, no sign I had ever been there. I returned home shaken, unable to explain what I had experienced. I didn't tell anyone at work. Friends assumed I was exaggerating. But I couldn't stop thinking about the lake, the whispers, the figures, the footprints that had no origin. And the thought that still haunts me the most, Echo Lake isn't on any official map. It shouldn't exist. Weeks later, Mike called. "So, did you go?" he asked casually. I froze. "Yeah," I said, my voice tight. "Yeah, I went." There was a pause. Then he said, "Good. Some places, they only let you leave if they decide you're done." I never heard from him again. I swore I would never go back. I've tried to forget, but sometimes I dream of the lake. I dream of the faces under the water, the figures in the trees, circling silently, waiting. And I can't help but wonder how many others have stumbled into Echo Lake and why it seems to claim them without a trace. I don't hike anymore. I don't travel into the woods. I stay in the city, among the noise, the lights, the people. But the forest, it's still calling. I can feel it. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear the faintest whisper of water, just beneath the wind, just beyond the streetlights. And I know it's still out there, waiting. The stories say if you follow the wrong trail, the lake finds you, and I know now that it does. Once you see Echo Lake, it never forgets you. Story the end. The sun had already dipped below the horizon when Tom and Sarah finally turned off the main highway and onto the winding dirt road that led deep into the Montana wilderness. Their GPS flickered erratically, each recalculation taking longer than the last until it finally blinked out altogether. The radio, too, had given up somewhere along the route, leaving nothing but the hum of the car engine and the distant calls of coyotes that seemed closer than they should be. Tom adjusted the rearview mirror and gave Sarah a tight-lipped smile. "Almost there," he said, though the road ahead twisted into shadowed curves that didn't look promising. They were heading to an old family cabin, one that Tom had only visited once as a boy. His grandfather had built it decades ago, far from any neighbor, perched on the edge of a forested ridge. The thought had seemed romantic at the time, a weekend disconnected from the chaos of city life. But as the trees thickened around them and the sky darkened, the silence started to feel oppressive. Every snapped twig or rustle in the brush seemed amplified, as if the forest itself was watching. When they finally arrived, the cabin looked smaller than Tom remembered, its wooden siding gray with age and weather. A thin layer of dust coated the porch, and the screen door creaked loudly as Sarah pushed it open. Inside, the smell of old pine and decay was strong, mingled with the faint tang of something metallic. "Smells like it hasn't been touched in years," Sarah whispered. Tom nodded, but there was an edge to his nod, something like hesitation he wasn't ready to voice. They unpacked quickly, trying to shake off the unease that seemed to settle in their chests like a weight. As night fell fully, the forest outside grew almost unnatural in its quiet. The usual sounds of nocturnal life, owls, insects, wind, were subdued, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Tom started a small fire in the stone fireplace while Sarah unpacked food. The flames flickered weakly, casting long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls. It was Sarah who first heard it, a low, deliberate knock at the front door. "Probably a branch," Tom said without looking up, though his voice lacked conviction. Another knock, slower this time, followed. Sarah froze. There was no path leading directly to the cabin from the road that Tom knew of, just the dense forest. "Maybe someone's lost?" she ventured cautiously. Tom set down the fire poker and approached the door. When he opened it, the air was empty, the forest dark and still. No footprints in the thin layer of frost, no sounds beyond the whispering of wind through the trees. "Weird," he muttered, closing the door and locking it. The rest of the night passed in tense silence, each snap of wood from the cabin settling or a distant branch causing them to jump. Around 2 a.m, Sarah woke to a whisper. "Tom," she sat up abruptly, heart racing, and listened. There was nothing. Shivering, she shook Tom awake, but he was groggy, dismissing it as a dream. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing just outside the cabin. Tom's dismissal faded quickly when they both heard the faint scraping of something dragging across the wooden porch. Tom grabbed a flashlight, moving to the door with Sarah behind him. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on nothing but the empty porch and the deep shadows beyond. "Must be an animal," Tom said, though his voice had a brittle edge now. "Probably a deer or—" A sudden, loud bang on the cabin wall cut him off, and the flashlight flickered. The beam swung wildly, catching on the shape of a man, or some resembling one, staring at them from the tree line. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its eyes reflected the light in a way that made Sarah's stomach knot. The thing didn't move, but the intensity of its stare froze them both. Then it vanished, as if swallowed by the darkness. Tom grabbed the keys, determined to drive back to the highway, but the car wouldn't start. The engine turned over and then died with a groan. Panic rose, and Sarah suggested they wait until morning. Tom argued, feeling the gnawing fear of being trapped, but even he knew deep down that the night had grown too oppressive to stay inside. They huddled in the living room, keeping the fire alive, listening. The sound outside had changed. It was no longer just footsteps or knocks. There were whispers now, low and guttural, in a language neither of them recognized. Sometimes they sounded like they were right next to the windows. Sometimes they drifted away and back again. Sleep became impossible. Around 4 in the morning, Tom noticed something strange on the windows. Handprints, smeared from the outside, but not wet with rain or dew. More than that, the prints weren't human. The fingers were too long, the palms too wide, the spacing uneven. Sarah gagged when she touched one. The wood beneath felt slimy and cold, almost pulsing. By sunrise, the first real light in hours, they debated leaving on foot. The forest looked different in daylight, oppressive but slightly less menacing. Tom tried to navigate the dirt road back to the highway, but each step seemed longer, the path twisting and folding in ways that made no sense. Trees seemed to shift positions when he looked away, familiar landmarks disappeared, and the sounds of the forest became impossible to locate. Hours passed. Their water was low, their food dwindling. By late afternoon, they stumbled across an old hunting cabin deep in the woods. It was empty, or at least seemed so. The door creaked as they entered, revealing a room lined with crude symbols painted in dark red. Sarah gagged again. The symbols weren't random. They looked like they were carved into the wood in places, as though someone had pressed something alive against it to leave the mark. Then they heard the laughter. Low, wet, almost human, echoing from every corner of the cabin. Tom shined his flashlight across the walls, and the beam caught hundreds of eyes, reflecting back at him from the shadows. There was no hiding it. They weren't alone. The figures emerged slowly from the dark, thin, hunched, their faces twisted in grotesque mimicry of human expressions. They didn't speak, didn't attack immediately. They just watched. Sarah screamed, and one of the figures tilted its head, whispering in that strange guttural tongue. Her mind went blank with terror. They ran, stumbling back through the forest, trying to retrace their steps. Every tree, every path seemed to conspire against them. They would come to a clearing they thought they knew, only to find it completely unfamiliar. Their sense of direction disintegrated. Hours passed, but the sun barely moved. It was as if the forest itself was holding time hostage. Exhausted, they collapsed beside a small creek, desperate to drink. Tom leaned down to scoop water, and the reflection he saw on the surface made him freeze. Behind them, barely a few feet away, one of the thin figures crouched, watching. Its eyes were black pits. Its mouth opened, emitting the same low, wet laugh. Tom grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her to her feet. "We have to run," he whispered, voice trembling. They darted through the underbrush, branches slapping their faces, roots tripping them. For hours, they ran. The figures followed, always at the edge of sight, disappearing when they focused directly on them. Finally, after what felt like days, they broke through the tree line onto the dirt road. The car was still there, seemingly untouched, and miraculously it started on the first turn of the key. They drove without stopping, the forest behind them silent, as if nothing had ever been there. When they finally reached the highway, Tom and Sarah stopped at the first gas station. Shaking, pale, they told the clerk they'd been lost. He nodded sympathetically, pouring coffee without comment. But when they looked out the window at the forest in the distance, the edge of the tree line shimmered slightly, as if it had a life of its own. Neither of them ever spoke about what happened again. They didn't tell their friends, didn't return to Montana, and never looked at a map of the area. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, Sarah swears she hears that low, wet laugh coming from the trees outside her apartment, and Tom can't help but glance at every shadow, searching for the impossibly thin figure with black pit eyes, waiting silently just beyond sight. Story, the end. The road narrowed as the shadows deepened. I pressed my foot to the accelerator, eyes fixed ahead, adrenaline brewing in the hollow of my chest. The GPS read, entering no signal area, but I'd toggled it off anyway, thinking silence of all kinds was best out here. Beside me, the packed duffel leaned against the passenger door, heavy with gear and expectations. A solo trip, one last one before I attempted to figure out what came next. I'd driven half the state already, through cornfields turning brown with fall's cruelty, then farther, where the map's little gray town icons vanished and only Forest Crossing, 12 me remained. I'd rented that beat-up truck suited for gravel roads and old haulers, with life in its wrinkles. I left at sunrise, rolling out of the city's hum, hoping the wildness would cleanse me. The destination, a secluded cabin in the woods, deep in the upstate of Maine, at the end of the road, as the rental host had promised. She explained it. You'll know you're there when the pavement ends. I didn't doubt her. The pavement ended. The truck juddered slightly as the asphalt gave way to gravel. The headlights' beams cut through low-hanging branches. My phone drifted into no service mode, 3 bars disappearing like a breath. I slowed, the night creeping in earlier than I expected. I found the cabin's driveway, a narrow ramp of deep ruts between thick evergreens. The trees seemed to lean in as though curious, almost patient. I parked, unlocked the cabin's door, and stepped inside. Exhale. Inside was simple. A wood stove in the corner, stacked firewood, bare pine floors, windows facing the forest. The smell of sawdust mixed with cold air stinging through the gaps. I dropped the duffel, unzipped it, pulled out my gear. Laptop, notebook, camera, boots. I intended to write and record. The host had told me, no neighbors closer than 5 miles. Perfect. Just me and wilderness. At night, I sat by the stove and built a flame, sank into a creaking armchair with a mug of tea. Outside the window, the forest exhaled darkness. By midnight, the wind began. It hissed between trees, sharp and urgent. I glimpsed a flicker of something white moving between trunks. Thought, deer. But the shape darted away too fast, too upright. My skin crawled. The next morning, I ventured out onto the deck, coffee in hand. The sky was brittle blue, the forest silent, but for occasional bird calls. I tramped down the path a little, just enough to breathe solitude. I paused, camera in hand, trained on a knot in an old pine trunk. Odd pattern in the wood that looked like a monstrous face when angled in the morning light. I snapped photo after photo. Back in the cabin, I checked them. On one image, a pale figure crouched behind the tree face, limbs folded inhumanly. I frowned. The figure was vague, grainy, but the shape was unmistakably humanoid. I frowned and looked at it again. Then I looked out the window. Nothing. I tried logic. Trick of light, lens flare, motion blur. I shrugged and accepted. Maybe the forest wanted to play tricks. I felt uneasy, but still there was something constructive about being on the road, writing. Evening came. The light leveled, the forest closing in. I had dinner. A can of chili warmed. Outside, the wind picked up again. The cabin's structure moaned. I heard a crack, a branch breaking near the roof. I glanced through the window. The deck light flickered. I rose, walked to the switch. Nothing changed. I imagined power flicker, but then the wood stove's flame sputtered. The logs popped. I leaned closer, and I heard footsteps, slow, heavy, outside the door. My breath hitched. I set down the mug. The footsteps moved around the perimeter, circling. The moonlight cast long shadows across the deck railing, and I saw them. 2 slender forms moving behind the trees, their limbs long, gangly. Their heads tilted in unnatural arcs. They watched. The deck light flared, then darkness swallowed them. I exhaled, heart hammering. I flicked the lights inside, locked the door. I bolted the window shutters. I sat in the armchair, knees drawn up, eyes fixed on the door. What could I do? Call someone? No cell service. The only other option was the road. But who would reach me out here? I waited. Hours passed. No more footsteps. The quiet pressed in. Eventually I rose, crept to the window, and peered out. I saw them again. One of the figures stood at the tree line, distant, but definitely facing me. It tilted its head and stepped into a gap in the pines. Gone. I tried to sleep, but the blanket felt too thin. Every creak and gust made me flinch. At dawn, I resolved to go back to civilization. I packed hurriedly, grabbed keys, opened the door, and found footprints on the deck. 2 sets. Deep, elongated like shoes too big for a human. And the wood railing had scratches, deep gouges. I snapped photos, my heart pounded. 30 minutes later, I was back on the gravel road, driving fast, hands gripping the wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my truck's bed partly visible, and saw a silhouette rise behind the trees, between the trunks. It didn't move, just watched. Then it turned and vanished. Back in town, I pulled into a service station. Phone bars creeped back to life. I called my friend Kate. I told her to book me a hotel. I'd come down from the cabin tonight and stay where I could see other people. I'd try to calm down. I told myself maybe I was tired or the isolation playing mental tricks. Kate reassuring, said, "It'll be fine." Night in the hotel was restless. Every small noise made me jump. The reception desk joked about wildlife scratching at doors. I smiled politely, but sleep didn't come easy. Next morning, I went back to the cabin's region. I didn't want to, but I needed closure. I parked near the driveway and walked in, camera in hand. The cabin door was locked. I must have latched it when I left, but the deck was trashed. The railing had more gouges, logs scattered. The wood stove inscription, an etched symbol on the side, had been freshened, new charcoal embedded. The symbol, two vertical lines and a circle between them, something I hadn't seen before. I pressed fingers to the symbol. Cold. Strange energy. I looked around the deck for the footprints. Gone. Only small scattered debris. The pines stood as quiet watchers. I went inside. The kettle was still on the stove. Cold. I found footprints again, inside. Not human. Long, narrow, and deep in the dust on the floor. I followed them to the basement hatch. I hadn't intended to go down there. The hatch was closed. I leaned and heard scratching below, soft but distinct. I hesitated, then pulled the handle, and the hatch swung open, creaking. I flipped the switch. No light. With my phone torch, I descended. The stairs led down to a crude stone cellar. The smell was damp. The walls had etchings. Same symbol repeated dozens of times. Two vertical lines, circle, two vertical lines. I recognized it from the stove. On the floor lay a circle, painted in white, primitive. In the middle, a small pile of deer antlers and a piece of human cloth, threadbare shirt. My blood ran cold. I raised the phone's light and glimpsed movement. I froze. Two figures scuttled in the corner, thin, pale, crouched. They turned toward me, their faces stretched unnaturally, mouths fissured. They hissed. I backed up the stairs, heart in my throat. They scratched. I shoved the hatch shut and bolted it. I ran upstairs, grabbed my camera, and fled the scene. Driving out, I didn't stop until I saw pavement again. I booked the first plane out. Weeks later, back home, I tried to resume normal life. But the image of those figures haunted me. I replayed the photos. On one, I saw them lurking at the tree line. On another, the cellar symbol glowed faintly. I began researching the area. I found references to old logging camps, missing persons, unmarked graves. I found one article about a forest watchman figure in local folklore, the watcher between pines, never captured, glimpsed only by drivers, hikers, and cabin renters. One night I woke to scratching on my window, my city apartment, 10th floor. I froze. I heard breath, trap-like. I pulled the curtain slightly, nothing but dark. But I smelled wood smoke, pine. My blood stilled. I backed away and looked at my phone. Message notification, we keep the place safe. You may go. No sender. I backed up. I deleted everything about that trip. But the feeling, the paranoia, those figures follow me. I booked a therapy session but didn't say much about them. It sounded insane. They were still out there, in the forest, watching. And then one morning I found that same symbol. Two vertical lines, circle, two vertical lines, etched on my apartment door. Fresh, scratched, the same thin, unfamiliar hands. I couldn't explain it. I tore it out, scrubbed it, sealed it, but sleep still eluded me. Last night I dreamed of that cellar. I watched the figures rise, elongate into trees themselves, their limbs merging with bark. One reached out to me with a frozen grin, its eyes hollow. The circle between the lines glowed. I screamed and jerked awake. I see them now whenever I sit by a window at dusk, shadows that linger too long, branches that lean too far. They don't need to come for me, they just wait. They watch. I keep the curtains drawn, I keep the lights on. I changed apartments, I changed cities, but the footsteps in the gravel, the hatch in the woods, they were real. The circle was painted. The antlers piled, the cloth there, the symbol now behind me, carved into the doorframe of every safe place I think I have. If you ever drive into nowhere, rent a cabin where the map ends and the forest begins. Pay attention when something moves between trees, not quite deer. Don't ignore the symbol scratched in wood. Don't dismiss the footprints that seem too long for a man's stride. Because the watchers don't just vanish when you leave. They follow the marks you carry. And sometimes they wait until you're back in your safe place, until you think you're home. Story, the end. The cold air hit them the moment they stepped off the unpaved road. The kind of cold that feels alive, crawling beneath your skin, biting at your lungs when you breathe too fast. The forest was dense, the trees close enough that they blocked almost all sunlight, though it was late afternoon. A faint mist had begun to form around the trunks, a swirling silent fog that clung to the ground. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter and shivered, feeling the isolation in her bones. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Mike asked, his voice low, almost swallowed by the wind. He had insisted on taking the shortcut his coworker had told him about. Now, staring at the narrow dirt trail that disappeared into the forest, he was beginning to regret it. "This has to be it," Sarah said, though even she wasn't certain. The GPS on her phone barely registered a signal, flickering in and out, stubbornly insisting they were off-grid. The trail snaked deeper into the forest, littered with fallen branches and rocks. Every step echoed in the quiet, making it seem as if the forest itself was listening. Hours earlier, they had laughed at the idea of getting lost, joking that nothing could happen in rural America without someone noticing. But the deeper they went, the more the jokes faded. They had come to photograph abandoned places, a hobby that had started in college and grown into something of an obsession. Their latest find was an old logging town, abandoned decades ago, with buildings rumored to still hold remnants of the past. They hadn't expected the place to be completely off the grid, tucked away in a remote part of the Appalachian wilderness. After a long, treacherous walk, they found the first building. It was a small wooden shack, half collapsed, with the remnants of a broken fence surrounding it. The wood was rotting, nails rusted through, and the windows were empty eye sockets staring at them. Mike raised his camera, snapping pictures quickly, while Sarah hesitated, uneasy. "I don't like this," she said, voice trembling slightly. "Feels wrong." Mike shrugged. "Relax, it's just an old shack. People left it here and didn't come back, probably decades ago." He moved toward the doorway, peering inside. The air smelled of damp earth and rot, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. "See? Nothing. Just a building." But as he stepped further inside, Sarah noticed a faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound, a rhythm like nails dragged across wood coming from deeper within the forest. She called out to him, but he waved it off. They decided to push further, moving from building to building. Each structure was worse than the last. Collapsed roofs, doors barely hanging from rusted hinges, graffiti scrawled in the walls with strange symbols. There was no sign of life anywhere, except that scratching sound following them, always just behind. By evening, the fog thickened, turning the forest into a gray labyrinth. The sun disappeared behind the trees, leaving them in near darkness. They found a larger building, a 2-story house with boarded-up windows. They approached cautiously, the air growing colder with every step. Sarah's gut twisted. The sense of being watched was unbearable now. Inside, the house smelled of decay and mold. The wooden floor was unstable, every creak echoing ominously. They explored slowly, photographing the remnants of furniture, torn curtains, and old personal items left behind. In one room, Sarah found a child's diary, pages yellowed and brittle. The entries were mundane at first, talking about school, friends, and chores. But then the tone shifted, becoming darker, speaking of things in the woods and the eyes watching me. Her hands shook as she showed it to Mike. Did you see this?" He frowned. "Probably just some kid's imagination. Old diaries always get weird when they're decades old." They continued upstairs. A bedroom door creaked open, revealing a small room with a broken bed and a cracked mirror. Sarah paused, staring at her reflection. Something moved behind her in the glass, a shadow darker than the surrounding gloom. She whipped around, heart pounding, but nothing was there. Then the scratching started again, louder this time. Not just wood, but metal and stone, like something digging. It was coming from outside the house, circling them. Panic rose. "We need to go," she whispered urgently. Mike nodded reluctantly, and they ran down the stairs, out of the house, into the fog. But the trail they had taken in the afternoon was gone. Trees had shifted, or maybe they were imagining it. Every direction looked the same, thick mist and tangled underbrush. They realized then they were lost. Hours passed. They tried retracing steps, calling out, but the forest swallowed their voices. By midnight, their phone batteries were dead, and the temperature had dropped. They huddled together near a fallen tree, trying to stay warm. That's when they saw it. A figure, hunched, thin, and impossibly still just beyond the tree line. It didn't move like a human, too fluid, too silent. They froze, terrified. The scratching ceased, replaced by an eerie, low hum that vibrated in their bones. They tried running, but every direction seemed to lead them back to the same spot. Panic turned to desperation. Sarah remembered something from the diary. Don't follow the eyes. They will take you. She didn't know what it meant, but instinct screamed at her not to look directly at it. They stumbled blindly through the forest. Time lost meaning. Shadows danced at the edges of their vision, shapes that shouldn't exist. Every step was met with a cold gust, the smell of damp earth growing overpowering, tinged with something metallic. At some point, Mike fell, scraping his hands and knees on jagged rocks. Sarah tried helping him up, but a loud, guttural screech filled the air, freezing them in place. The figure was closer now, just visible through the fog, tall, limbs bent at unnatural angles, eyes glowing faintly like embers. It didn't move in a normal way. It seemed to glide, as if the forest itself carried it. They ran again, instinct overriding thought. Branches whipped at their faces, roots snagged their feet, but they didn't stop. Eventually, they reached a clearing with a shallow stream. Relief flooded them. Light from the moon reflected off the water, and they thought they might find the road beyond. Then they saw the footprints. They weren't human, narrow and elongated, with claw-like indentations. They were everywhere, circling the clearing. And then came the whispers, soft, urgent, 1,000 voices speaking at once. They didn't form words, just emotions, fear, despair, warning. Sarah grabbed Mike, dragging him along as the whispers grew louder, echoing in the fog. They ran until the first rays of dawn. The forest began to thin, and eventually they stumbled onto a dirt road. Relief washed over them as they saw the faint outline of a car in the distance. But when they reached it, it wasn't theirs. An old pickup, rusted and abandoned with the door open as if inviting them inside. They didn't approach. Something deep in their gut told them to keep moving. Hours later, exhausted, bloodied, and shaking, they found a ranger station. The ranger listened, skeptical at first, but the state of their clothing and sheer terror convinced him. They reported the area, but when a search party went in, nothing was found. No abandoned town. No footprints. No evidence that anyone had been there except the occasional animal tracks. Weeks later, Sarah received a package with no return address. Inside was the child's diary, identical to the one she had found, except the last entry had changed. They returned, and now they watch. Even after leaving the forest, the scratches persisted at night, faint at first, then growing, echoing from the shadows of their home. Mike never spoke of it again, and Sarah moved cities, but the feeling of being followed never left. The remote forest, the abandoned town, the figure, they were real. And if anyone asks, the locals only give a vague warning. Some places are better left forgotten. The woods remember you. Story, the end.